In this section, I'd like to talk about tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is caused by the bacterium Mycobacterium tuberculosis. It has that bacillus shape, and it's what we call an acid-fast bacterium. It has a really unique waxy coating on the outside that helps protect it and also makes it a little bit more difficult to diagnose. The disease tuberculosis is sometimes called white death or consumption, and it's estimated that up to 1/3 of the world's population, so over 2 billion people, are currently infected with tuberculosis. It has been identified as far back as 17,000 years before the present in bison in Wyoming. So this is not only an infection that can affect humans, it can affect cattle and related animals as well. Some other examples from tuberculosis in history include a 7,000-year-old mummy whose spine was eaten away by the disease. It is well known that families in India would prevent marriages into a family with tuberculosis. And in fact, it was the most common cause of death in the 17th century. In the 18th and 19th century in New England, so not even that long ago, the residents of New England would dig up and destroy corpses of tuberculosis victims because they thought that those corpses could suck the life out of the living. And this was not unique to the Northeast. There were many other cultures that believed the same thing. This is a text from Mesopotamia describing tuberculosis. What he coughs up is thick and frequently bloody. His breathing sounds like a flute. His hand is cold, his feet are warm. He sweats easily and his heart activity is disturbed. So we've known about tuberculosis and this disease for a very long time. But as always, we did not identify the cause of the disease until the 1880s. So the bacterium that causes tuberculosis was identified in 1882 by Robert Koch. Hopefully you remember him from his discovery of the cholera bacterium. Generally, tuberculosis, at least now, is a disease of the urban poor. During the Romantic period, a lot of artists and celebrities got tuberculosis. And because of this, it almost romanticized this idea of wasting away. So people who were thin, who had pale skin, but they would have rosy cheeks. That was the look to go for, the tuberculosis look. Lots of authors, some of them listed here, again, romanticized this look about tuberculosis. The Broadway show Rent is based on the opera La Bohème, which is about tuberculosis as well. This was an infographic from Kentucky. The Second World War, 6,800 Kentucky soldiers died in battle of wounds or disease. Almost 8,000 people during that same period died of tuberculosis. So tuberculosis was still pretty common in the U.S., even in World War II. So again, here, this is talking a little bit about La Bohème, so you can go ahead and read this at your convenience. But why was this admired? Well, because they thought that people who were intellectual and creative were more susceptible to tuberculosis. So death was also prominent in paintings, and it became a fashionable disease. So many of you may remember, especially in the 1990s, it was really fashionable for models to be like stick thin. So back in the 1800s, it was really popular for them to look like they had tuberculosis. How is it spread? Well, it's spread through aerosol transmission. It's a respiratory infection. Infected individuals will cough and sneeze because the bacterium has gotten into their lungs. And those droplets are highly infectious because fewer than 10 bacteria can cause disease. So here's an old poster from New York. Prevent disease, careless coughing, spitting, and sneezing spread influenza and tuberculosis. The most recent data I found were from 2019, where there were about 10 million new cases diagnosed worldwide, leading to about 1.4 million deaths. And it's estimated that a person with active infection can infect 10 to 15 people a year. Those with latent infection, and that's going to be most people, are non-infectious. So you're only worried about people who are actively coughing and sneezing. This is another poster. This one is from, I believe, Maryland. Don't kiss me. Your kiss of affection, the germ of infection. So, leave the baby alone. The symptoms of tuberculosis can first mimic other diseases, like a cold or like the flu. But eventually, when it has established itself in the lungs, active pulmonary tuberculosis will include significant chest pain, a lot of coughing, and bloody sputum. So not just coughing up mucus, but bloody mucus. And the actions of the bacterium within the lungs actually do lead to lung damage. I recently went to one of those bodies exhibits where they have all the preserved human bodies and cross sections and things like that. And inside of that exhibit, they had one on the respiratory system, and they showed the lungs of somebody who had tuberculosis. And you can see these giant cavities in the lungs where the bacterium had caused significant damage. The bacterium can also get outside of the lungs and affect bone, the central nervous system, and other organs. And so here you can see it affecting the skin of this patient. Without treatment, if it gets outside of the lungs, that's almost always fatal. Inside of the body, tuberculosis is one of those scary diseases because the bacterium can actually live inside of the cells that are meant to destroy it. So it can live inside of those macrophages. What eventually will happen is that groups of infected macrophages will come together and form what are called granulomas. So healthy, uninfected macrophages will wall off the infected macrophages, and that's the granuloma. And the idea behind the granuloma is that it can prevent the spread of infection, at least for a while. But as with all walls, eventually the walls fall down. The infected macrophages can escape and spread the infection again. To diagnose the infection, we first will usually turn to the tuberculin skin test, or sometimes it's called the PPD skin test. If you've ever worked with kids or if you've worked in a hospital setting, you've probably had to do this test. I was a substitute teacher for a while, so I had to do this. They inject a little bit of protein underneath your skin, and they wait for an immune response. If you have an immune response, that means that your immune system recognized tuberculosis, and you may have had the infection before, or you may currently be infected. If you have no reaction, it means you have no response, you've never had tuberculosis, you're good to go. The trick here is that this particular test can't differentiate between an active infection, so are you currently contagious, a latent infection, you have the infection, but you're not coughing or sneezing, so you're not really spreading it, or you've been vaccinated. Remember, the vaccine basically tricks the body into thinking you were infected, but really you weren't. So generally what we'll do is further blood testing to look for the presence of actual bacteria, and of course a chest x-ray, and you're looking for these things like granulomas that have formed in the lungs. The invention of the stethoscope in 1816 made it easier to diagnose the infection because you could hear the infection in the lungs. Throughout history, there have been a number of different attempts to try to treat this infection. One of the first was to create what were called sanatoriums, or basically places where people with tuberculosis could go. They would have fresh air, a good diet, etc. And this worked because patients were given nutrition, which helps boost the immune system and can help fight infection. But it also helped prevent spread because infectious patients were all isolated together instead of out in the community. You could also try to get the royal touch. Of course, monarchs were blessed by God, so they could hopefully treat you by touching you. And you could do surgery to remove the infected areas, so those pockets of the granulomas. These are better treatments than the ones I'm going to show you next. The Romans would bathe in human urine, drink elephant's blood, and eat wolf liver. I'd prefer the sanatorium. In Arabic countries, they would sometimes drink donkey's milk or consume powdered crab shells. Again, doesn't seem as bad as what the Romans did. I think the Romans were worse off. In terms of prevention, there was a big stigma around the disease. We saw the example of some Indian families that would not let intermarriage happen if one of the families had tuberculosis. In other countries, infected individuals can be prohibited from public gatherings. But really, prevention involves hygiene and access to medical care, and also vaccination. The most common vaccine is called the BCG vaccine, and it was first used in the 1920s. The vaccine works because it's made from a very closely related bacterium. So the body will mount an immune response against that bacterium, but it's pretty close to the tuberculosis bacterium, so it usually works. There are debates about its effectiveness. It may not always prevent pulmonary tuberculosis, but it does seem to prevent the dissemination of disease to the rest of the body. And remember, if tuberculosis can spread through the rest of the body, that's most dangerous. So even if it's not fully protective, if it protects you against the worst symptoms, maybe that's okay. The public was slow to accept the vaccine for a lot of different reasons, one of which was that there was an accident in the 1930s where 240 infants were actually vaccinated with tuberculosis instead of Mycobacterium bovis, and almost all of them got tuberculosis, and 72 of them died. It is on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines, the vaccine for tuberculosis. It is not commonly given in the United States. We don't tend to have a lot of tuberculosis. We do have thousands of cases every year, but not like we see in other countries. The vaccine is universal in Central and South America. It is also common in lots of other countries. One of my first grad students, when I got to school here at Fresno State, was from India, and every time she took the tuberculin test, she always showed up positive. She says, "I've never had tuberculosis, but I was vaccinated." And so they'd have to do the blood test and the x-ray to make sure that she was fine. Antibiotics work pretty well against tuberculosis, or at least they used to. The discovery of the antibiotic streptomycin really helped. And then scientists were able to develop specific antibiotics that work really, really well, specifically against the tuberculosis bacterium, that have led to decreases in the numbers of infection. Here's our modern distribution of tuberculosis. You can see it is found, pretty much everywhere, but in parts of like sub-Saharan Africa, Indonesia, and some parts of the South Pacific over here above Australia, it's a little bit more prevalent than in other parts of the world. So in the U.S., again, we do have tuberculosis. States like California, Texas, and some major cities, like listed here on the side, have higher incidence than the national average, whereas some of these states in light blue are below the national average. So why hasn't it gone away? We have a vaccine, we have effective antibiotics. Well, unfortunately, what we're now starting to see is multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. The thing about this bacterium that makes it really difficult to treat with antibiotics is that it grows really, really slowly. And when a patient is prescribed antibiotics, instead of like the 10 to 14 days we typically think of when you get antibiotics, with tuberculosis, a patient needs to be treated for anywhere from at least 6 to 9 months. So you are relying on patient compliance, and that doesn't always happen. We can see that in some parts of like Eastern Europe, we're starting to see relatively high levels of multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. And so that makes it impossible to treat. So multi-drug resistant tuberculosis is found in at least 500,000 people a year. Other times, if you know somebody has tuberculosis, it can still be difficult to find and treat them. So for example, this was a case a few years ago. A man who refused treatment for tuberculosis was arrested. So he's a public health threat. When I was a master's student in Stockton, there was a case where a guy had drug-resistant tuberculosis and he refused to be treated, and they did the same thing. They arrested him. Of course, because of international travel and immigration, you have the potential to have these diseases spread. So this was an outbreak at a Kansas high school that infected 27, tuberculosis outbreak in Atlanta. There was even a case at Fresno City a few years ago of tuberculosis. So drug-resistant tuberculosis is very expensive in terms of money, but also in terms of the human cost. 9% die, 27% stop working, 37% require home isolation, 73% are hospitalized. So multi-drug resistant and extensively or extremely drug-resistant tuberculosis, while rare in the United States, are becoming more common worldwide and are of significant concern. So here down at the bottom, regular tuberculosis, treatment 6 to 9 months, cost of $17,000. Multi-drug resistant, 20 to 26 months, cost $260,000. So this bar, the gray or the bar with the little infographs, is the direct cost of your hospitalization, your medicine, etc., where the blue is the loss of productivity, like you couldn't go to work. And then here, extremely or extensively drug-resistant tuberculosis, treatment 32 months, cost over $500,000. So it can be very, very expensive to have tuberculosis. One of the other major concerns, I showed you that picture of the world earlier where sub-Saharan Africa has really high levels of tuberculosis. Well, tuberculosis and HIV as a co-infection is really, really dangerous. And so in sub-Saharan Africa, we also have really high incidence of HIV. So having HIV is a huge risk factor for tuberculosis because it suppresses the immune system. So patients with HIV are nearly 30 times more likely to be infected with tuberculosis. And actually, tuberculosis is one of the leading causes of death for patients with HIV. So your risk factors for tuberculosis include HIV infection, if you work with or treat tuberculosis patients, if you have family members that have tuberculosis, if you travel to areas of the world where it's endemic, or if you have other conditions that can be immunosuppressive like diabetes, cancer, etc.